Missouri sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard as Carolyn Whitmore stepped out of her sedan. At 58, she had spent decades building a life far removed from the remote farmhouse before her. A life that included a successful career in Chicago and 2 grown children who barely remembered this place. But now, standing at the edge of the gravel driveway, Carolyn felt an uneasy pull toward the weathered structure where so many of her childhood memories, good and bad, had taken root. Elias Whitmore, her father, had passed away 6 weeks ago after a brief illness. It was strange how death could soften even the sharpest edges of resentment. For years, Carolyn had told herself she didn't care about him or his secrets. He had been paranoid, distant, and impossible to please. His obsession with locking every door and shuttering every window had made their home feel more like a fortress than a family dwelling. Still, when the lawyer called to inform her that Elias had left the farmhouse to her, something deep inside stirred. A mix of curiosity and obligation she couldn't ignore. The front porch creaked under her weight as she climbed the steps, her suitcase bumping against the railing. She unlocked the heavy oak door with the key provided by the estate attorney and stepped into the musty interior. The air smelled faintly of cedar and mildew, and sunlight filtered through dusty curtains, illuminating swirls of floating particles. Everything looked exactly as it had the last time she'd been here, 25 years ago, when she stormed out after yet another argument with her father. Carolyn set her suitcase down and wandered through the rooms, each one evoking fragments of her past. In the kitchen, she ran her fingers along the chipped formica countertop, remembering mornings spent watching her mother cook breakfast, while Elias read newspapers at the table, his brow furrowed in perpetual suspicion. Upstairs, the bedrooms were frozen in time, untouched since her mother's death 15 years earlier. Her own room still held faded posters of boy bands she no longer recognized, and her bed was neatly made, as if waiting for her return. But it was the study, her father's domain, that drew her attention most. The heavy oak desk sat beneath a barred window, its surface scarred with scratches and ink stains. Carolyn hesitated before opening the top drawer, half expecting to find it empty. Instead, nestled among old receipts and tax forms, was a small brass key taped to the underside of the drawer. Beneath it lay a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. Her breath caught as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, tight, precise, and slanted slightly to the right. The message was brief but chilling. Don't sell the house until you've seen what I left below. Below? Carolyn frowned, turning the page over as if expecting more. There was nothing else. No explanation, no context. Just those 7 words scrawled in ink that had bled slightly into the brittle paper. She glanced around the room, searching for clues. The walls were lined with bookshelves crammed with volumes on history, cryptography, and survivalism, topics that had always baffled her. A faded map of Missouri hung crookedly beside the fireplace, its edges curling upward. Nothing seemed unusual, yet the letter gnawed at her thoughts. What could Elias have meant by below? And why would he insist she see it before selling the property? Her gaze fell on the floorboards near the desk. They looked older than the rest of the house, warped and uneven. Kneeling, she examined them closely and noticed a faint seam running parallel to the wall. With trembling hands, she inserted the brass key into what appeared to be a hidden latch. There was a soft click, and a section of the floor lifted just enough for her to grasp it. Peering into the darkness below, Carolyn felt a chill crawl up her spine. A narrow staircase led downward, disappearing into shadows too deep for the dim light from the study to penetrate. Her pulse quickened as she reached for the flashlight app on her phone, illuminating the first few steps. Whatever her father had hidden down there, it clearly wasn't meant to be found easily. Taking a deep breath, Carolyn descended into the unknown, the wooden stairs groaning beneath her weight. The air grew cooler and damper with each step, carrying the faint scent of earth and metal. At the bottom, she found herself in a cramped basement illuminated only by the beam of her phone. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars of preserves, tools, and boxes labeled in Elias's meticulous script. And then she saw it, a large metal trunk in the center of the room, its surface scratched and dented, as though it had endured years of neglect. A rusted padlock secured it shut, but nearby lay another key, resting conspicuously atop a folded blanket. Carolyn picked up the key, her heart pounding. Whatever secret her father had kept locked away, it was finally within reach. Yet as she stood there staring at the trunk, a wave of doubt washed over her. Did she really want to know what lay inside? Or would opening it only dredge up more pain from a relationship she'd worked so hard to leave behind? For now, she closed the lid gently and climbed back upstairs, leaving the basement and its mysteries undisturbed. But the letter's warning lingered in her mind, a quiet echo that refused to fade. Whatever Elias had left for her, it wasn't going to stay buried forever. The next morning, Carolyn woke to the sound of bird song filtering through the cracks in the farmhouse's wooden shutters. Sunlight streamed into her room, but the warmth did little to ease the unease that had settled over her since discovering the letter in the mysterious trunk. She lingered by the window, staring out at the overgrown fields stretching toward the horizon. This place was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to close the chapter on her complicated past with Elias. But instead, it felt like stepping into a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. After breakfast, she returned to the basement, determined to make some sense of what her father had left behind. The air smelled faintly of damp soil as she descended the creaking stairs, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. The metal trunk still sat where she'd found it, untouched and forbidding. But today she focused on the shelves lining the walls. They were crammed with dusty jars, rusted tools, and stacks of yellowed papers tied together with brittle twine. Carolyn began sorting through the clutter, hoping to find something, anything, that might shed light on her father's cryptic message. Most of the documents were mundane. Old bills, receipts, and faded photographs of a younger Elias standing beside tractors and livestock. But then, tucked beneath a pile of rotted crates, she uncovered a set of blueprints rolled tightly and secured with a rubber band. Unfurling them carefully, she realized they were detailed floor plans of the farmhouse, and they didn't match the layout she knew. The drawings showed an additional room, an underground chamber connected to the basement by a narrow passageway. Carolyn's pulse quickened as she traced the lines with her finger. The hidden space wasn't marked on any official records she'd seen during the estate settlement process. Why would Elias go to such lengths to conceal part of his property? And why had he never mentioned it? Her curiosity deepened when she noticed a small notation near the edge of the blueprint. Sealed hatch, do not disturb. Beneath it was a crude sketch of a radiation symbol. A chill ran down her spine. What could possibly warrant such a warning? Determined to investigate further, Carolyn moved the crates aside, revealing a patch of dirt-covered floorboards beneath. Kneeling, she brushed away layers of grime until her fingers caught on something solid. A metal ring embedded in the wood. Her heart raced as she tugged gently, uncovering a concealed latch. The boards groaned as she lifted them, exposing a dark opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Peering inside, she saw only darkness. Whatever lay beyond this point was completely inaccessible without proper tools or help. Reluctantly, she climbed back upstairs, deciding she couldn't tackle this alone. She needed someone familiar with the area, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. That's when she remembered Mason Kelly. Mason was a local handyman in his late 50s, known around town for his quiet demeanor and steady hands. A retired Army veteran, he'd earned a reputation for fixing everything from leaky roofs to broken fences. Carolyn had met him briefly when he stopped by earlier in the week to offer condolences about Elias's passing. Something about his calm presence had put her at ease, and now she hoped he might be willing to lend a hand. She found him tinkering with an old tractor in his driveway, sweat glistening on his brow despite the cool morning air. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," he said, tipping his cap. "What brings you out here?" "I need your expertise," Carolyn replied, explaining the situation as succinctly as possible. She omitted the cryptic letter in the trunk, focusing instead on the discovery of the hidden latch and the strange blueprints. "I think there's another room down there, but I can't get to it without damaging the floor. Would you mind taking a look?" Mason studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Sounds like quite the mystery, he said finally. Let me grab my gear. Back at the farmhouse, Mason examined the hatch with practiced precision. Using a crowbar and a hammer, he pried away the remaining boards, revealing a heavy steel door marked with faded radiation symbols. Carolyn's stomach tightened as she stared at the ominous warning. Do you know what these mean? She asked, gesturing to the emblem. Mason nodded grimly. They're caution signs for hazardous materials. Could be anything from chemicals to old military equipment. Your dad must have gone to great lengths to seal this off. Why would he do that? Carolyn murmured, more to herself than to Mason. And why leave it here at all? That's the million-dollar question, Mason said, brushing dust from his hands. You want me to open it? Carolyn hesitated, torn between fear and fascination. Whatever lay behind the hatch, it was clearly important to Elias, and dangerous enough to warrant such elaborate precautions. Finally, she nodded. Yes, but let's proceed carefully. With Mason's help, they managed to pry the hatch open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into even deeper darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and metallic, carrying a faint chemical tang. Carolyn shone her flashlight down the steps, illuminating rough concrete walls lined with pipes and wires. At the bottom, she could see the outline of another door, this one reinforced with thick bolts and hinges. This isn't just a storage space, Mason muttered, his voice low. Looks more like a bunker. A bunker, Carolyn echoed, her mind racing. What kind of man builds a secret underground shelter in the middle of nowhere? And why would he leave it locked away after his death? As they stood there peering into the abyss, Carolyn felt the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on her. The answers were close now, just beyond that final door. But she couldn't shake the feeling that opening it would change everything. Still, she knew one thing for certain. Turning back wasn't an option anymore. Let's see what's inside, she said quietly, gripping her flashlight tighter. The beam of Carolyn's flashlight cut through the oppressive darkness as she and Mason descended the narrow staircase, each step echoing ominously in the confined space. The air grew colder with every foot they ventured downward, carrying a metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the weight of the silence, broken only by their cautious footsteps and the faint creak of rusted hinges behind them. This place felt like a tomb, untouched by time or human hands for decades. At the bottom of the stairs, they paused before the reinforced steel door. Its surface bore more radiation symbols, faded but still legible, along with a stenciled warning in bold block letters, authorized personnel only. Carolyn exchanged a glance with Mason, who gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. Together they pushed the door open with effort, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside they were met with an eerie tableau, frozen in time, a perfectly preserved relic of the Cold War era. Rows of metal shelves lined the walls, stocked with government-issued supplies. Canned goods labeled with dates from the 1960s, water purification tablets, medical kits sealed in plastic wrap, and stacks of wool blankets folded neatly atop one another. A desk sat against the far wall, its surface cluttered with yellowing maps, notebooks, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment, antique cameras, reel-to-reel tape recorders, and even a shortwave radio covered in dust. But it was the safe embedded in the corner of the room that drew Carolyn's immediate attention. Unlike everything else, it looked almost new, its matte black finish gleaming faintly under the flashlight's glow. The dial spun freely when she tested it, but without the combination, it remained stubbornly locked. This isn't just a shelter, Mason said, his voice low and measured as he surveyed the room. It's something else. Surveillance gear, classified documents. He picked up a binder lying on the desk, flipping it open to reveal typewritten pages stamped with red seals marked Top Secret. His brow furrowed as he skimmed the contents. Looks like your dad was keeping tabs on someone, or being kept tabs on. Carolyn's pulse quickened. She moved closer to examine the items scattered across the desk. Among the papers was a photograph, its edges curled with age. It showed Elias standing beside two men in military uniforms, all three wearing grim expressions. In the background loomed a sign reading, "Restricted Area No Entry." Her father looked younger here, his face leaner, his eyes sharp and alert. Not the paranoid recluse she remembered from her childhood. "What is this place?" she whispered, half to herself. "Why would my father build something like this?" Mason didn't answer right away. Instead, he wandered over to a large map tacked to the wall, its surface dotted with pins and scribbled notations. "This looks like a grid of local landmarks," he said, tracing the lines with his finger. "See these markings? They correspond to old missile silos and communication towers. Your dad must have been monitoring activity in the area." "Monitoring for who?" Carolyn asked, her voice tinged with frustration. None of this made sense. Elias had always been secretive, yes, but this level of preparation suggested paranoia on a scale she hadn't imagined. Was he working for the government or hiding from it? Her gaze returned to the safe. Whatever secrets lay inside, they were likely tied to everything else in the bunker. But how could she possibly open it without the combination? She turned back to the desk, rifling through drawers in search of clues. Most contained nothing useful: pens, paperclips, spare batteries. But then she found a small notebook tucked into the back of one drawer. Flipping it open, she discovered rows of numbers written in Elias's familiar handwriting. "Could these be combinations?" she asked, holding up the notebook. Mason took it from her, studying the entries carefully. "Worth a shot," he said, crossing the room to the safe. After several tense minutes of trial and error, there was a soft click and the door swung open. Inside the safe was a single metal case, about the size of a shoebox. Carolyn lifted it out cautiously, setting it on the desk. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Inside were reels of microfilm, a stack of photographs, and a folded document bearing yet another red seal. Unfolding the paper revealed a typed letter addressed to Elias. Subject: Operation Red Horizon. Classification: Top Secret. Effective immediately. You are authorized to establish and maintain covert operations within designated rural zones. Further instructions will follow via secure channels. All communications must remain encrypted and untraceable. Carolyn stared at the words, her mind reeling. Operation Red Horizon? What did it mean? And why had her father been involved in something so clandestine? "We need to get these to someone who can make sense of them," Mason said quietly, breaking the silence. "A historian, maybe, or someone with clearance." "No," Carolyn replied firmly, closing the lid of the case. "Not yet. I need to figure out what all this means first. My father left this for me, for some reason. I owe it to him and to myself to understand why." Mason hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but we're playing with fire here, Miss Whitmore. Whatever your dad was mixed up in, it wasn't small time. People don't go to this much trouble unless they're scared of something, or someone." As they packed up the case and prepared to leave the bunker, Carolyn couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only scratched the surface of Elias's secrets. The air in the shelter seemed heavier now, charged with history and dread. Each step back toward the light above felt like leaving behind a piece of her father's shadowy past, but also stepping deeper into the mystery he'd left behind. And somewhere deep down she knew, whatever answers lay ahead, they wouldn't come easily. The farmhouse kitchen felt too small that evening, its familiar creaks and groans amplified by the weight of what Carolyn had uncovered. She sat at the table, the metal case from the bunker spread open before her, its contents laid out like pieces of a puzzle she didn't yet know how to assemble. The microfilm reels glinted faintly under the overhead light, while the photographs stared up at her. Grainy images of men in lab coats standing beside rows of steel tanks labeled with cryptic codes. But it was the dossier marked Operation Grafton that held her attention now. Bound in plain black leather, its pages were filled with typewritten reports in heavily redacted sections, their stark black bars obscuring names, dates, recipes, and entire paragraphs. Carolyn flipped through them slowly, her fingers trembling, as she absorbed fragments of information that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. One report stood out, a memo dated October 1963, addressed to Elias Whitmore personally. It referenced something called targeted viral control agents, a phrase that sent a chill down her spine. The language was clinical, detached, but the implications were horrifying. These weren't just experiments. They were weapons. Biological weapons designed not just to kill, but to manipulate populations on a massive scale. Carolyn's stomach churned as she read further. One passage described field tests conducted in rural areas far from prying eyes or major population centers. Missouri was mentioned explicitly, along with several other states scattered across the Midwest. The goal, according to the document, was to evaluate the effectiveness of these agents under real-world conditions without detection. "What does this mean?" Mason asked quietly, leaning over her shoulder. He had insisted on staying after helping her bring the materials upstairs, his curiosity outweighing any reservations he might have had about getting involved. Now, as he scanned the pages, his face grew pale. "Field tests? Your dad was part of this?" "I don't know," Carolyn whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the man she'd known, the paranoid recluse who hoarded canned goods and kept every door locked, with the person described in these documents. Could Elias really have been complicit in such a thing? Or had he been coerced, trapped in a situation he couldn't escape? She turned to another page, this one detailing supply shipments delivered to undisclosed locations throughout the early 1960s. Among the items listed were vials of experimental pathogens, chemical stabilizers, and crates of protective gear. At the bottom of the page, a handwritten note caught her eye. "EW, ensure containment protocols are strictly followed. Failure is not an option. Failure is not an option." The words echoed in her mind, cold and unyielding. What would failure have meant for Elias, for the people living in those targeted areas? And why had no one ever spoken of Operation Grafton before? If her father had been involved in something so monstrous, surely there would be records somewhere. Historical accounts, conspiracy theories, anything. Yet aside from the documents in front of her, there was nothing. Mason sank into the chair opposite hers, rubbing his temples. "This isn't right," he muttered. "If the government was running bioweapons programs in rural America, someone would have blown the whistle by now. People talk. Secrets don't stay buried forever." "Unless they're supposed to," Carolyn replied darkly. She gestured to the redactions covering nearly half the text. "Look at this. Whoever wrote these reports went to great lengths to erase evidence. Maybe they succeeded. But why leave it all behind?" Mason countered. "Why stash it in a bunker and leave clues for you to find? If your dad wanted to protect himself, he could have destroyed everything. Instead, he left it here. For you." Carolyn froze, staring at him. The thought hadn't occurred to her until now. Her father hadn't simply hidden these documents. He had preserved them, protected them, as if he knew someday someone would need to uncover the truth. Her gaze drifted back to the photographs. In one image, Elias stood beside a group of scientists in a sterile laboratory setting. They wore full-body suits and respirators, their faces obscured except for their eyes. Behind them loomed a row of glass-fronted chambers containing trays of petri dishes and sealed vials. A label on the wall read, "Biocontainment Unit 7. Something about the photo triggered a memory, a fragment of a conversation she'd overheard as a child. She'd been eavesdropping outside her parents' bedroom when Elias's voice had cut through the quiet, sharp, and urgent. "We can't let it get out," he'd said. "Not again." At the time, she'd assumed he was talking about money or some minor crisis. Now she wondered if he'd been referring to something far more sinister. "We need to figure out where these field tests took place," Carolyn said suddenly, breaking the silence. "If we can pinpoint the locations, maybe we can find witnesses or survivors." Mason frowned. "You're talking about digging up graves, Miss Whitmore. People who lived through whatever happened probably aren't eager to relive it. And if anyone finds out you're poking around—" "I don't care," she interrupted, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "This isn't just about my father anymore. If what's in these documents is true, then innocent people were used as guinea pigs. Entire communities could have been wiped out, or worse." Mason studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, but we do this carefully. No sudden moves. Start with local archives, old newspapers. See if anything matches up with the dates and locations in those reports. And keep your eyes open. You never know who else might be watching." As Mason gathered his things and headed for the door, Carolyn remained seated at the table, her thoughts swirling. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but the bigger picture was still shrouded in shadows. Whatever Operation Grafton had been, it wasn't confined to the past. Its legacy lingered, buried beneath layers of secrecy and denial. And now, thanks to her father's cryptic letter and hidden bunker, Carolyn found herself standing at the edge of a dangerous precipice. The truth was waiting for her, but so were the consequences of uncovering it. The next morning, Carolyn sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by the contents of the metal case. The microfilm reels and classified documents were spread out around her. But it was the small tin canister labeled Test 14B that drew her attention. Its surface was scratched and tarnished, bearing no other markings except the cryptic label scrawled in faded ink. Whatever it contained, it had clearly been important enough for Elias to preserve. She hesitated before opening the canister, her fingers trembling as she twisted off the lid. Inside was a length of 8 mm film coiled tightly, its edges brittle with age. Holding it up to the light, she could see faint images frozen within the frames, shadowy figures moving against grainy backgrounds. But without a projector, the secrets trapped inside remained elusive. That's when she decided to call Milo Dresden. Milo was a name she'd heard whispered in hushed tones during her research into Cold War-era conspiracies. A retired investigative journalist turned amateur historian, he had spent decades chasing down leads on covert operations and government cover-ups. His work had earned him both accolades and enemies, though most dismissed him as a paranoid conspiracy theorist. Still, if anyone could help her restore and interpret the film, it was him. She found his number in an online directory and dialed, bracing herself for rejection. To her surprise, he answered on the second ring, a gravelly voice tinged with curiosity. "This is Dresden. Mr. Dresden, my name is Carolyn Whitmore," she began, explaining her discovery in brief terms. "I have an old 8 mm film reel that I believe contains sensitive material. I was hoping you might be able to help me view it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then slowly, Milo spoke. "Sensitive how?" "I think it shows experiments," Carolyn admitted, choosing her words carefully. "Possibly involving biological weapons. My father may have been involved." Another pause, longer this time. When Milo finally responded, his tone was measured but intrigued. "Bring it over, but be careful who else knows about it." Milo's home was a cluttered labyrinth of books, files, and outdated electronics tucked away on the outskirts of town. Carolyn arrived just after noon, clutching the film canister like a fragile artifact. Milo greeted her at the door, his wiry frame draped in a threadbare cardigan. His sharp eyes scanned her face as he ushered her inside. "This way," he said, leading her to a dimly lit room dominated by an ancient film projector perched atop a rickety table. Surrounding it were shelves crammed with reels of various sizes, some labeled, others anonymous. The air smelled of dust and mildew, mingling with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Carolyn handed him the canister, watching as he carefully loaded the film onto the projector. "You sure you want to see this?" he asked, glancing at her. There was no judgment in his voice, only caution. She nodded, steeling herself. "Yes." The room fell silent as Milo switched on the machine. The screen flickered to life, revealing grainy, black and white footage. At first, it seemed innocuous. An empty laboratory, rows of medical equipment arranged neatly along the walls. Then came the children. They were orphans, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed, clad in ill-fitting clothes that hung loosely on their frail bodies. Most appeared to be Eastern European, their features marked by hardship far beyond their years. They shuffled into the frame, one by one, guided by men in lab coats who wore expressionless masks. Each child carried a numbered placard, held stiffly against their chests. The camera lingered on them as they were seated in chairs arranged in a sterile white room. Tubes and wires connected them to machines monitoring heart rates and oxygen levels. One boy, no older than 10, coughed violently, doubling over as blood spattered onto his lap. A technician stepped forward, jotting notes on a clipboard without so much as a glance at the child. Carolyn's breath hitched as tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to look away, but something compelled her to keep watching, to bear witness to what these children had endured. Then came the final moments of the reel. The scene shifted abruptly to a close-up of a microphone, its red light blinking steadily. A voice crackled through the audio, low and strained, the unmistakable timbre of Elias Whitmore. Test 14B concludes, he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Subjects exhibited expected symptoms within 72 hours. Mortality rate remains consistent with prior trials. A long pause followed, heavy with unspoken weight. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, I should have destroyed this. The screen went dark. For several seconds, neither Carolyn nor Milo spoke. The silence in the room felt suffocating, pressing down on them like a physical force. Finally, Milo cleared his throat. What you just saw, it's worse than anything I've uncovered in 30 years of digging. Those kids, they weren't volunteers. They were victims. Carolyn swallowed hard, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Do you recognize any of this? The location? The people? Milo shook his head. Not specifically, but the methods. They match descriptions I've read about secret bioweapons programs run by both sides during the Cold War. Programs that officially never existed. He paused, studying her intently. Your father wasn't just observing, Miss Whitmore. He was part of it. Maybe not willingly, but still. Carolyn's mind reeled. The man in the footage hadn't been the same Elias she remembered, the distant, paranoid figure who locked every door and hoarded supplies. This Elias had been complicit in atrocities, documenting horrors with clinical detachment. And yet, there was that last sentence. I should have destroyed this. He regretted it, she murmured, more to herself than to Milo. He knew what he'd done, or seen, and he couldn't let it go. Milo leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. If your dad left this for you, it means he wanted you to know, to understand. But understanding won't undo what happened. Are you prepared for where this trail might lead? Carolyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the blank screen, haunted by the faces of the children. Their suffering hadn't ended with their deaths. It lived on in the memories of those who survived, in the shadows cast by Operation Grafton. And now, it lived in her too. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. I'm prepared, because walking away wasn't an option anymore, not when the ghosts on film demanded justice. The farmhouse study was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Carolyn sat at her father's desk, the metal case from the bunker open before her once more. She had already sifted through its contents multiple times. But something nagged at her, a feeling that she'd missed something crucial. The microfilm reels, the classified documents, the 8mm footage. They all pointed to a larger truth. Yet there were still gaps in the story. Gaps only Elias could fill. Her gaze drifted to the safe embedded in the wall, its door slightly ajar. It had yielded little when they first opened it, just the metal case and a few scattered items. But now Carolyn wondered if there was more to discover. Perhaps it wasn't just a container for secrets. Perhaps it held answers. She crossed the room and knelt beside the safe, peering inside. At first glance, it appeared empty, save for a thin layer of dust coating the bottom. But as she angled her flashlight beam, she noticed a false panel along one side, cleverly concealed by the dimpled texture of the steel. Her pulse quickened as she pried it loose with her fingernail, revealing a hidden compartment within. Inside lay 3 objects, a small lead vial, no bigger than her thumb, a faded photograph, and a folded sheet of paper covered in Elias's handwriting. Carolyn's breath caught as she lifted each item carefully, laying them out on the desk like artifacts from another time. The lead vial was cold to the touch, its surface etched with symbols she didn't recognize. A tiny screw cap sealed the top, and a label wrapped around its middle bore the warning, "Handle with extreme caution." Whatever was inside, it was clearly dangerous, and significant enough for Elias to safeguard it in such an elaborate manner. Next, she turned to the photograph. It showed Elias standing beside a man who looked distinctly out of place among the rural Missouri landscape. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp Slavic features and piercing eyes, He wore a lab coat over what appeared to be military fatigues. Scrawled on the back of the photo in Elias's hand were two words: R. Galloway, Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk. Carolyn's stomach tightened. She recognized the name. It was a major scientific hub in Soviet Russia during the Cold War, known for its secretive bioweapons research facilities. If Elias had been working alongside someone from Novosibirsk, it meant Operation Grafton wasn't solely an American endeavor. This was international collusion, buried so deep that even history had forgotten it. Finally, she unfolded the sheet of paper, her hands trembling, as she began to read her father's confession. If you're reading this, Carolyn, then I'm gone and my sins are yours to bear. I wish I could tell you I was innocent, that I fought against the darkness instead of becoming part of it. But the truth is far uglier. Operation Grafton was never about defense. It was about control. Biological warfare tailored to specific populations, designed to cripple without leaving traces. The Soviets called it genetic targeting. We called it population-specific warfare. Either way, it was monstrous. I stole this vial, the last remaining sample of a pathogen engineered to devastate Eastern European bloodlines, because I couldn't let them use it. They would have unleashed it on civilians, children included, if given the chance. I hid it here beneath the earth where no one would find it, hoping to bury the nightmare along with my guilt. But the guilt doesn't die. Neither do the memories of those we failed to save. If you found this, then the choice is yours. Destroy the vial or ensure it stays hidden forever. Just promise me one thing. Don't let anyone else get their hands on it. Your father, Elias Whitmore. Tears blurred Carolyn's vision as she finished reading. The weight of his words pressed down on her, heavy and unrelenting. For years, she had resented him for his paranoia, his secrets, his inability to connect with her. Now she understood why he had been the way he was, and the burden he had carried alone for decades. "What are you going to do?" Milo asked softly from the doorway. He had arrived earlier to check on her progress, sensing she might need support. Now he stood watching her, his expression unreadable, but his presence steady. Carolyn stared at the vial, her mind racing. Destroying it would erase the immediate threat, but also any chance of proving what had happened. Leaving it buried risked discovery by someone less scrupulous, someone who might see its potential, not as a horror, but as a weapon. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of making the wrong decision." Milo stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "There's no right answer here, Miss Whitmore. Only choices and consequences. What feels right to you?" She thought about the children in the footage, coughing blood as men in lab coats took notes. About the communities erased from existence, their stories buried under layers of secrecy. About Elias sitting alone in this very room, writing his confession with shaking hands. "I'll keep it hidden," she said finally, her voice firm despite the ache in her chest. "For now. But I won't stop until the world knows what happened. Until the people responsible are held accountable." Milo nodded, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "Just remember, digging up graves has a way of waking the dead." As he left the room, Carolyn carefully resealed the vial and placed it back in the hidden compartment, locking the safe behind her. The silence in the study felt heavier now, charged with the knowledge of what lay concealed within its walls. Yet amidst the dread, there was also resolve. Elias had entrusted her with his final act of defiance, a chance to expose the horrors of Operation Grafton and honor the lives lost to its cruelty. And Carolyn Whitmore, for all her fears and doubts, was determined not to let him down. The days that followed were a blur of late nights and restless mornings. Carolyn pored over every scrap of information Milo could unearth about R. Galloway, the enigmatic Soviet scientist whose face stared back at her from the faded photograph. Each new discovery only deepened the mystery surrounding him and Elias's connection to it. Milo proved invaluable in piecing together fragments of Galloway's life. Using his network of contacts, retired journalists, archivists, and even former intelligence operatives, he uncovered a trove of declassified documents and obscure interviews buried in Cold War-era archives. What emerged was a portrait of a man caught between two worlds, torn apart by loyalty and conscience. Rudolph Galloway had been a rising star in Novosibirsk's bioweapons program during the early 1960s, known for his brilliance and unorthodox methods. But as tensions escalated between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, Galloway grew disillusioned with the ethical compromises demanded by his work. In 1964, he defected to the United States under mysterious circumstances, claiming asylum and offering classified information about Soviet biological warfare initiatives. For a time, Galloway thrived in America, working alongside American scientists on joint projects aimed at countering Soviet advancements. His expertise made him indispensable, but also dangerous. According to one redacted memo Milo found, Galloway began voicing concerns about the moral implications of their research, particularly regarding population-specific agents designed to target specific ethnic groups. Then, in late 1965, he disappeared without a trace. Official records listed him as a deserter, suggesting he'd fled back to Russia or gone rogue. Unofficial accounts painted a darker picture: whispers of betrayal, silenced voices, and covert operations meant to erase loose ends. But what tied Galloway to Elias Whitmore? Carolyn found the answer in an unlikely place: a box of old letters tucked away in the attic. The handwriting on the envelopes was unfamiliar, but the return address confirmed they were from Galloway. Most of the correspondence was mundane, discussing agricultural yields and weather patterns. But one letter stood out. Dated March 1965, contained a single sentence scrawled hastily across the page. "They're watching us, Elias. If anything happens to me, tell them the truth." Her heart raced as she read the words again and again. Watching us. The phrase suggested Elias hadn't just worked with Galloway. He had sheltered him, protected him. And if Galloway's warnings were true, then Elias might have witnessed or even tried to prevent his murder. She shared the letter with Milo, who immediately recognized its significance. "This changes everything," he said, pacing the study. "If your dad was hiding Galloway, it means he knew exactly how high the stakes were. People don't vanish like that unless someone powerful wants them gone." "But who?" Carolyn asked, frustration edging her voice. "Who would have killed him?" Milo stopped mid-step, his expression grim. "That depends. Was Galloway planning to expose Operation Grafton publicly? Or did he stumble onto something bigger, something neither side wanted getting out?" Carolyn didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her attention to another clue, hidden among Elias's belongings. A newspaper clipping dated April 1965. The headline read, "Local man found dead near abandoned silo, authorities rule suicide." Beneath it was a grainy black and white photo of a body being carried away on a stretcher. The victim's face was obscured, but the caption identified him as Robert Grayson, 38, of Springfield. Something about the name struck a chord. She rifled through the stack of documents Milo had brought, searching for any mention of Grayson. When she finally found it, her blood ran cold. A confidential report listed Grayson not as a local farmer, but as a CIA field operative tasked with monitoring defectors. His death had been ruled a suicide, but the details were suspiciously vague. "He wasn't just monitoring Galloway," Carolyn murmured, connecting the dots. "He was protecting him, or trying to silence him." Milo nodded slowly. "And if your dad was involved, he might have been there when it happened, maybe even tried to stop it." Carolyn's mind raced. If Elias had witnessed Grayson's death, or worse, Galloway's murder, it would explain why he became so paranoid, locking himself away in the farmhouse and obsessing over secrecy. It wasn't just guilt driving him, it was fear. Fear of being discovered. Fear of becoming the next target. Determined to learn more, Carolyn decided to visit the site where Grayson's body had been found, an abandoned missile silo located miles outside town. With Mason accompanying her for safety, they drove down winding dirt roads until they reached the decaying structure. Overgrown weeds choked the perimeter, and rusted barbed wire sagged around the fence line. Despite its dilapidated state, the silo exuded an eerie aura, as though it still held secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud. As they explored the grounds, Carolyn noticed something unusual near the entrance, a patch of earth that looked recently disturbed. Kneeling, she brushed away loose soil, revealing the edge of a metal plate embedded in the ground. Her pulse quickened as she pried it open, uncovering a shallow compartment containing a waterproof bag. Inside was a small journal bound in leather, its pages brittle with age. Flipping it open, Carolyn recognized Galloway's handwriting immediately. The entries detailed his growing paranoia, chronicling encounters with shadowy figures and cryptic threats. One passage stood out. Elias says I can trust no one, not even those who claim to protect me. He believes they will come for me soon, and perhaps for him as well. If these words are found, know this. Operation Grafton is not finished. Its architects remain untouchable, their crimes buried beneath lies. Seek justice, but beware, the cost may be higher than you imagine. Tears welled in Carolyn's eyes as she closed the journal. For years she had resented her father for keeping her in the dark, for burdening her with unanswered questions. Now she understood why he had done it. Elias hadn't been running from his past, he had been guarding hers. Standing amidst the ruins of the silo, Carolyn made a silent vow. She would honor Galloway's plea for justice, and her father's sacrifice, no matter the cost. The farmhouse was quiet when Carolyn returned from her visit to the abandoned silo, but the stillness felt wrong, unnatural, like the calm before a storm. She hadn't noticed anything unusual at first, stepping inside and setting the journal she'd found down on the kitchen table. It wasn't until later, as dust settled over the Missouri hills, that she realized something was missing. It started with the film reel. She had left it on the desk in the study alongside Elias's handwritten confession, intending to review both again after dinner. But now the canister labeled Test 14B was nowhere to be found. Panic rising in her chest, she rifled through the papers scattered across the desk, searching for the confession. It too was gone. Her hands trembled as she checked every drawer, every shelf. Nothing else appeared disturbed. The microfilm reels, the classified documents, even the lead vial hidden in the safe were untouched. Whoever had broken in hadn't come for valuables or random items. They knew exactly what they wanted. A cold realization settled over her. This wasn't just a burglary. It was a message. Mason arrived within the hour, his face grim as Carolyn recounted what little she could piece together. No signs of forced entry, he said after inspecting the doors and windows. Whoever did this knew how to get in without leaving a trace. Carolyn nodded numbly, her mind racing. If the intruder had bypassed locks so easily, they must have been familiar with the property, or prepared with advanced tools. Either way, it meant one thing. They weren't amateurs, and they weren't done. While Mason searched the house for further clues, Carolyn wandered into the basement, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain. The bunker door stood slightly ajar, its hinges creaking softly in the damp air. As she descended the narrow staircase, her flashlight beams swept across the concrete walls, illuminating shelves lined with dusty supplies and forgotten relics. The room looked unchanged since her last visit, but something about it felt off. Kneeling near the desk, she ran her fingers along the edge of a floorboard. It shifted ever so slightly beneath her touch. Her pulse quickened as she pried it loose, revealing a small compartment concealed beneath. Inside lay a bundle of wires and circuitry wrapped in yellowed tape, surveillance equipment decades old but unmistakably functional. Wiretaps. Her breath hitched as she examined them more closely. These weren't modern devices. They dated back to the 1980s, judging by their design. Yet someone had maintained them, replacing components and ensuring they remained operational long after Elias's death. Someone had been listening. By the time Milo arrived, Carolyn was sitting on the basement steps, the wiretaps clutched in her lap. He took one look at her pale face and immediately understood. Without a word, he knelt beside her, studying the equipment with sharp, practiced eyes. "These aren't leftovers from your dad's paranoia," he said finally, his voice low and urgent. "They're active surveillance tech. Someone planted these here and kept them running all these years." "But why?" Carolyn asked, her voice trembling. "Why would anyone care about this place after all this time?" Milo hesitated, his expression darkening. "Because whatever your father hid isn't just history. It's still dangerous. Whoever orchestrated Operation Grafton doesn't want the truth coming out. Not then, not now. They've been watching, waiting, making sure no one stumbles too close to the edge. Carolyn's stomach churned. You think they killed Galloway? And maybe Grayson? I don't think they did, Milo corrected sharply. And if you keep digging, they'll do worse. This isn't some dusty conspiracy from 50 years ago. This is alive, real, active. He paused, gripping her shoulder firmly. Someone's still watching. They never stopped. Later that night, Carolyn sat alone in the study, staring at the empty space where the film reel and confession had once been. The weight of Milo's warning pressed down on her, heavy and unrelenting. Every creak of the old house sounded louder than before, every shadow sharper. She tried to convince herself it was paranoia talking, but deep down, she knew better. The intruders hadn't just taken evidence. They had sent a clear signal. Stop now, or face the consequences. Yet despite the fear gnawing at her insides, Carolyn couldn't bring herself to walk away. The faces of those children haunted her, their hollow eyes, their blood-streaked hands. Galloway's desperate plea echoed in her mind, urging her to seek justice. And Elias's final act of defiance reminded her why she had come here in the first place. She pulled the journal Galloway had left behind from her bag, flipping it open to a marked page. His handwriting filled the margins, frantic and uneven. Elias believes we are being hunted. Perhaps he is right. But silence will not protect us. Only truth can. Truth. That single word burned brighter than any threat. Whatever risks lay ahead, Carolyn knew she couldn't turn back. Not now. Not when the cost of staying silent was written in the lives of innocents lost to Operation Grafton. As midnight approached, she made her decision. With trembling hands, she began packing the remaining documents and evidence into a secure case. Tomorrow, she would reach out to trusted contacts, people who might help amplify Galloway's story without putting themselves directly in harm's way. Journalists, historians, activists, anyone willing to listen. Because someone needed to break the silence. And if no one else would, then it had to be her. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that mirrored Carolyn's mood. She had spent most of the night poring over Galloway's journal, piecing together fragments of his final days, and searching for any clue that might lead her to the architects of Operation Grafton. Sleep eluded her, replaced by a restless vigilance born of fear and determination. Mason arrived early, carrying a thermos of coffee and a grim expression. He didn't say much at first, just nodded toward the kitchen table, where she sat surrounded by papers and photographs. You look like you haven't slept, he said finally, setting the thermos down beside her. I haven't, Carolyn admitted, rubbing her temples. Too much on my mind. Mason pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly around his mug. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, staring into the steam rising from his coffee. Then, without warning, he spoke, not about the break-in or the wiretaps, but about himself. You ever hear of Project Morning Light? He asked abruptly, his voice low and measured. Carolyn shook her head. No, should I have? It was a black ops program during Vietnam, Mason explained, his gaze fixed on the table. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, well, let's just say they weren't building schools or digging wells. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I was stationed at one of their facilities for 6 months, guard duty mostly, but I saw enough to know what happened there wasn't supposed to leave those walls. Carolyn leaned forward, her curiosity piqued despite her exhaustion. What kind of facility? Mason sighed as if bracing himself for something painful. Biological research, same kind of stuff your dad was involved in. They were testing agents, viruses, toxins, all designed to incapacitate or kill large groups of people without leaving traces. The brass called it strategic deterrence. We called it murder. His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Carolyn felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the connection between Mason's past and the secrets buried beneath her feet. Did you see anything happen? To people, I mean? Mason's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the mug. Yeah, once. A village near the base. They started getting sick. Coughing up blood, skin lesions, the works. Nobody could figure out why until later, when rumors started spreading about contamination zones. Turns out the wind carried some of the pathogens further than they planned. Hundreds died before anyone figured out how to contain it. And no one said anything? Carolyn whispered, horrified. Said what? That our own government screwed up and killed civilians halfway across the world? Mason barked a bitter laugh. Nobody talks about things like that, not unless they want to disappear. Carolyn's heart sank. Disappear? He nodded grimly. Cleanup teams, that's what we called them. Guys who showed up after whistleblowers or witnesses started asking too many questions. One day someone would be fine. The next they'd vanish. Car accident, suicide, whatever story stuck. It's how they kept the silence enforced. The phrase struck a nerve, echoing the title of Elias's confession. The silence was enforced. Carolyn stared at Mason, her mind racing. Do you think that's what happened to Galloway? And Grayson? Probably, Mason replied without hesitation. If your dad sheltered Galloway, he must have known the risks. Most guys in his position would have talked, took the deal, saved themselves. But Elias, he stayed quiet, kept the vial hidden, kept the records locked away. Maybe that's why he lived as long as he did. But I broke the rule, Carolyn murmured, more to herself than to Mason. I opened the safe. I read the confession. I took the film reel to Milo. I've been talking. To you, to him, to everyone. Mason's expression softened, though his eyes remained hard. Yeah, you have. And now you're in the crosshairs. Whoever broke in last night wasn't just sending a message. They were reminding you that the rules haven't changed. You stepped too far, and they'll come for you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of his words pressed down on Carolyn, suffocating in its clarity. She had always assumed the danger lay in the past, in the horrors of Operation Grafton and the lives it destroyed. Now she understood the truth. The danger was present, immediate, and very real. What do I do? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason reached across the table, placing a steady hand over hers. First, you protect yourself. No more late-night trips to silos or abandoned bunkers. Second, you decide how far you're willing to go. If you keep pushing, they won't stop coming. But if you quit now, he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Carolyn nodded slowly, absorbing his advice. Quitting wasn't an option, not when the cost of silence was written in the faces of those children on the 8mm film. Yet Mason's warning lingered, a stark reminder that bravery came with consequences. As the rain began to fall outside, tapping softly against the farmhouse windows, Carolyn made a silent vow. She would honor her father's sacrifice and Galloway's courage, but she wouldn't face this fight alone. She needed allies, resources, and a plan. Because whoever was watching wouldn't hesitate to act, and when they did, she had to be ready. Later that afternoon, as Mason helped her reinforce the locks on the doors and windows, Carolyn slipped the lead vial into a secure compartment in her car. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was insurance. Proof that she knew the truth, and proof that she could expose it if pushed too far. The silence may have been enforced once, but not anymore. Not while she still had breath in her lungs. The decision to go public didn't come easily. Carolyn spent days weighing the risks, replaying Mason's warnings in her mind like a broken record. Every instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to bury the evidence deeper, and walk away while she still could. But the faces of the children haunted her, their hollow eyes, their blood-streaked hands. Their silence demanded justice, and Carolyn knew she couldn't turn her back on them. Her breakthrough came when she reached out to Shadows of History, an investigative podcast known for uncovering Cold War-era atrocities that had been swept under the rug. Hosted by journalist Rachel Lang, the show had built a reputation for meticulous research and unflinching storytelling. If anyone could amplify Galloway's voice and Elias's confession, it was Rachel. Their initial call was brief but intense. Carolyn explained what she'd uncovered, careful not to reveal too much about her location or the specifics of the vial. Rachel listened intently, asking pointed questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter. By the end of the conversation, Carolyn felt a flicker of hope, not just for exposing Operation Grafton, but for ensuring her own safety in the process. I'll need proof, Rachel said finally, her tone firm but compassionate. Documents, footage, anything you can share without putting yourself in immediate danger. Carolyn hesitated, then agreed. She copied fragments of the microfilm reels, redacted sections of Elias's confession, and low-resolution screenshots of the 8mm footage onto a USB drive. The original materials stayed locked away in the farmhouse safe, along with the lead vial. If anything happened to her, Mason knew where to find them. The episode aired 3 days later, titled Operation Grafton, The Forgotten Atrocity. Rachel introduced the segment with a somber tone, explaining how Carolyn Whitmore, a Missouri woman cleaning out her late father's estate, had stumbled upon evidence of a covert biological weapons program targeting civilian populations during the Cold War. As clips of the 8mm footage played, accompanied by Rachel's measured narration, Carolyn sat alone in the farmhouse study, gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. This footage, believed to depict experiments conducted on Eastern European orphans, is among the most harrowing pieces of evidence we've ever encountered, Rachel said as grainy images of the children flickered across screens around the world. It raises serious questions about the ethics of bioweapons research during the Cold War, and the lengths governments went to ensure their secrets remain buried. The response was immediate. Within hours, social media erupted with outrage, hashtags like #ExposeGrafton and #Justice for the Silent trending globally. Historians weighed in, calling for declassification of related documents. Activists demanded accountability from both U.S. and former Soviet officials. Even mainstream news outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach exponentially. But amidst the growing momentum, darker forces stirred. The first threat arrived via email, sent to Carolyn's personal account. Its message was brief and chilling. Stop digging, or join the silent. She deleted it immediately, her hands shaking, and forwarded the header information to Rachel's team. They assured her they'd escalate it to cybersecurity experts, but warned her not to underestimate the sender's capabilities. The second threat came less than 24 hours later, this time scrawled on a piece of paper shoved under the farmhouse door. We know where you are. Mason found it when he arrived to check on her the next morning. His face hardened as he read the note, crumpling it in his fist. This isn't amateur work, he muttered, scanning the perimeter of the property. They're watching us. Carolyn nodded numbly, clutching the phone in her hand. She dialed Rachel's number, hoping for reassurance or guidance. Instead, the call went unanswered. Hours passed before Rachel returned it, her voice tight with urgency. Listen carefully, she began without preamble. I don't have much time. Milo, he's gone missing. His house is empty. No sign of struggle. I think whoever's behind this knows we're working together. Carolyn's stomach dropped. Milo, with his decades of experience chasing conspiracies, had always seemed untouchable. If they could take him. What do I do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Stay off the grid, Rachel instructed. Don't trust anyone except Mason. And whatever you do, don't stop fighting. The story, it's bigger than all of us now. That night, Carolyn lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as rain pattered against the windows. The farmhouse felt smaller than ever, its familiar creaks and groans magnified by fear. She thought about Milo, about Elias, about the children whose suffering had sparked this chain reaction. Each face was a reminder of why she couldn't give up, even if the cost was higher than she'd imagined. By morning, she had made her decision. With Mason's help, she packed the remaining evidence into a secure case and loaded it into her car. Together, they devised a plan to move her to a safe location, a remote cabin owned by one of Mason's old army buddies, deep in the Ozarks. It wasn't foolproof, but it bought them time. As they drove away from the farmhouse, Carolyn glanced back at the weathered structure one last time. It had been a prison for Elias, a tomb for his secrets. Now it was a battleground, and she was ready to fight, because the silence had been enforced for far too long. And Carolyn Whitmore intended to make sure it stayed broken. The flames consumed the farmhouse with a ferocity that shocked even Carolyn. It started in the dead of night, an unnatural orange glow flickering against the horizon as she and Mason drove toward the Ozarks. They were barely 20 miles out when Mason's phone buzzed with an alert from a neighbor. One frantic text reading, "Your place is on fire." Carolyn's heart sank as Mason pulled over to the side of the road. She stared through the windshield at the distant inferno, her mind racing. Smoke billowed into the sky, painting the stars black. Everything she had left behind, her father's belongings, the bunker, the secrets buried within its walls, was gone. "They're cleaning up," Mason said grimly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, making sure there's nothing left to find. Carolyn didn't respond. Her throat tightened as tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay calm. Crying wouldn't bring the farmhouse back or undo what had been lost. Instead, she reached for the secure case resting between them, clutching it tightly. Inside were the lead vial, a backup copy of the 8mm footage, and fragments of Elias's confession. Everything else, the microfilm reels, the classified documents, Galloway's journal, they were ashes now, scattered by the wind. Mason glanced at her, his expression softening. "We still have enough to fight with," he said quietly. "That's what matters." She nodded, though doubt gnawed at her insides. Enough to fight whoever was behind this operation had proven they wouldn't hesitate to destroy evidence, or people, to protect their secrets. And now, Milo was gone too. News of his death reached them the next morning. Rachel called, her voice trembling with anger and grief. "They found him in his car," she said, choking back tears. "Official cause of death is listed as a stroke, but we both know better." Carolyn closed her eyes, leaning against the wall of the cabin where they'd taken refuge. The image of Milo's weathered face flashed in her mind, his sharp eyes, his steady hands, his unwavering determination to uncover the truth. He had risked everything to help her, and now he was dead because of it. "I'm so sorry," Carolyn whispered, her voice breaking. "This is my fault." "No!" Rachel snapped, her tone fierce. "It's theirs! Don't you dare take that blame. Milo knew what he was doing. He chose to stand with you, just like I'm choosing to keep fighting." Before ending the call, Rachel mentioned something else. A final envelope delivered to her office earlier that week, postmarked from Missouri. It bore no return address, only Milo's unmistakable handwriting scrawled across the front, for Carolyn. Rachel promised to send scans of its contents immediately. When the files arrived later that afternoon, Carolyn opened them with shaking hands. Inside were photocopies of additional documents related to Operation Grafton, along with a handwritten note from Milo. He wasn't the only one with regrets. Look closer at the names. Some sins don't stay buried forever. Beneath the note was a list of individuals connected to the project. Scientists, operatives, government officials, all long thought retired or deceased. One name stood out among the rest. Dr. Evelyn Hargrove, a high-ranking biochemist who had vanished from public records after the Cold War. According to Milo's notes, she had overseen several classified programs, including those linked to population-specific bioweapons. Carolyn stared at the name, her pulse quickening. If Dr. Hargrove was still alive and involved, she might hold the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy, but finding her wouldn't be easy. Decades of silence had kept her hidden. Breaking through that veil would require more than courage. It would require proof. That evening, as rain lashed against the cabin windows, Carolyn sat alone at the kitchen table, poring over Milo's research. The fire had destroyed much, but not everything. Between the vial, the film, and the fragments of evidence salvaged from the farmhouse, she still had tools to wield. More importantly, she had allies, Mason, Rachel, and countless others inspired by the podcast episode to join the fight. As she traced the faded ink of Milo's note, a quiet resolve settled over her. He had given his life to ensure the truth didn't die with him. Now it was her turn to carry the torch. The farmhouse may have burned, but the embers of justice still glowed, and Carolyn Whitmore intended to fan them into flame. The modest home Carolyn now occupied was a far cry from the farmhouse she'd inherited, or the bustling city life she'd left behind in Chicago. Nestled on the outskirts of a quiet town in southern Missouri, it blended seamlessly into its surroundings, with weathered siding and a porch that sagged slightly under the weight of time. To her neighbors, she was Emily Carter, a retired schoolteacher seeking solitude after losing her husband. Only Mason and Rachel knew the truth, and even they didn't know everything. For weeks, Carolyn had kept her head down, focusing on staying off the grid while piecing together what remained of Operation Grafton. The lead vial sat locked in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, its presence both a burden and a lifeline. Fragments of Milo's research lined the walls of her study, pinned alongside maps, timelines, and photographs salvaged from the fire. Each new connection brought her closer to understanding, but also deeper into danger. Then one crisp autumn morning, a package arrived. It was unmarked, save for her alias scrawled across the front in block letters. No return address, no postage stamp, just a plain brown box left on her doorstep as if by ghostly hands. Her pulse quickened as she carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen table. Mason stood nearby, his arms crossed and his expression wary. "Don't open it," he warned, his voice low. "Could be rigged." Carolyn hesitated, then shook her head. "If they wanted me dead, they wouldn't bother with a package. This is something else." Using gloves, she carefully unwrapped the contents. Inside was an 8mm film reel, identical to the one stolen during the break-in, but this one bore a fresh label. Grafton Archive 3, West Coast Trials. Beneath it lay a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. She unfolded it with trembling hands, revealing a brief message written in unfamiliar handwriting. "You've only scratched the surface." The words sent a chill coursing through her veins. Whoever had sent this wasn't threatening her. They were taunting her, challenging her. They knew about Operation Grafton, about the farmhouse, about the evidence she'd uncovered so far, and they wanted her to keep digging. Mason leaned over her shoulder, scanning the note. "This could be a trap," he said grimly, "or a test. Either way, it's not random." "I know," Carolyn replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She turned the reel over in her hands, examining it closely. It looked authentic, its edges worn, and its label faded, as though it had been stored improperly for decades. But there was no way to tell what horrors or truths it might contain without viewing it. "We need to take precautions," Mason insisted. "Set up somewhere secure before we play it." Carolyn nodded, already formulating a plan. They would drive to Rachel's studio in St. Louis, where they could screen the footage using equipment designed to handle sensitive material. If the film revealed anything incriminating, Rachel could broadcast it immediately, ensuring the information reached the public before anyone could silence them again. As Mason packed their gear, Carolyn stared at the reel, her mind racing. Who had sent it? A whistleblower within the organization? Someone seeking redemption for past sins? Or another player in the game, testing how far she was willing to go? The questions swirled endlessly, but one thing was certain. Whoever had sent the package believed she was capable of finishing what Elias and Galloway had started. They were watching, not to stop her, but to see if she could succeed. Hours later, as dust settled over the countryside, Carolyn stood on the porch, gazing out at the horizon. The air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke, carrying with it a sense of fleeting calm. Somewhere out there, unseen eyes tracked her every move, but she refused to let fear dictate her next steps. Inside the house, the reel waited patiently, its secrets sealed away until she was ready to face them. For now, all she could do was steel herself for the battle ahead. The screen faded to black as Carolyn turned back toward the door, resolve etched into every line of her face. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.